Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Vicarage on this Tuesday morning. Nice to see you, and hope this finds you well and cheerful. And thank you, as always, for joining us today. I should just say, if you hear a noise next door, they've got builders in the school, so if you hear lots of sort of building work going on next door, it's not that my house is falling down, it's the work in the school next door. But you've come here to find out about the reading this morning, and we're in Luke's Gospel, chapter 6. So without further ado, I shall go straight into it. Luke chapter 6, I'm going to read you verses 1 to 16. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any of the priests to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.' On another Sabbath he taught and entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who was there had the withered hand, 'Come and stand here.' He got up and stood there. Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?' After looking round at them all, he said to them, 'Stretch out your hand.' He did so, and his hand was restored. They were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Now during those days he went out to the mountain to pray, and spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, there's kind of two bits, and there's the bit about the Sabbath, and there's a bit about the disciples. We'll do the Sabbath bit first. Jesus, in his life, showed his authority and his power over many things. He showed his power over demons, he showed his power over sickness, he showed his power over death, he showed his power over leprosy, he showed his power over the weather, all manner of things, okay, pointing to the fact that he's God. And in this reading this morning, Jesus demonstrates his power and authority over something else as well. He demonstrates his power and authority over the Sabbath day. Now, it might not sound a great deal to us, but to the people at the time, the Jewish people at the time, and to this day for that matter, as I understand it, the Sabbath is a very, very big deal. And you can kind of understand why. It's mentioned in the Ten Commandments, and it is in the Bible that we should take a day off a week. We should have the Sabbath day. And actually, it's been sort of proven that actually, physically and psychologically, we all need a day off, and that it's a very, very important principle. And the Sabbath is very important, and that's why God put it there, because actually we need time off, we need downtime, and we need time with our families and all that type of stuff. It's all very, very true. Problem is, though, the Jews had kind of itemized it almost out of existence. There were hundreds, and what they'd done is to try and interpret it. They'd written down literally hundreds of rules about things that you could and could not do on the Sabbath, itemizing every individual item, whether this counts as work or not, and blah, 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 blah. And that's what they'd done. And here we have, in this reading this morning, Jesus demonstrating his power over the Sabbath. The way it kind of works is kind of in two parts. Firstly, his disciples are walking along the edge of the field. They get a bit of some wheat, and they can rub it in their hands and eat it, which that is allowed. That's not stealing, that is allowed, that's mentioned. I think it's in the book of Deuteronomy, you are allowed to do that. The criticism is that they did it on the Sabbath day, and they take Jesus to task about it. Jesus' response is quite interesting. He doesn't argue with them according to the specifications that they laid down. Instead, he talks about an example where King David, who had troops had been exhausted, and they come looking for bread because they were really hungry, and they'd eaten they'd eaten the food which only the priest can have. In other words, because his troops were hungry and desperate, they had eaten food that they weren't really supposed to because they were desperate and so on. And what Jesus is saying, that's what they did. It can be done. And I think Jesus is saying, Jesus is saying here that, he is David's great grandson. but he's greater than David. And if David had to do that, so he demonstrates that he, as David's greater son, you might say, has Lord over the Sabbath as well. That Jesus is Lord over all things, and he can reinterpret what the Sabbath is. And he goes on to prove it, as always does, by this other story which Luke tags on the end here, about the story with the man with the withered hand. To prove that Jesus is Lord over the Sabbath, he heals this man of his withered hand on the Sabbath. A bit like Jesus proved he had authority to forgive sin by healing the man who'd been lowered down on the in front of Jim on the stretcher in the house that time. To prove it, he did that. Today, to prove he has power and authority over the Sabbath, he goes ahead and he heals this man on the Sabbath. Interesting enough, Jesus himself not raising a finger at any point through it. Thus, Jesus proves that he explains that he is Lord of the Sabbath, and he shows that he is as well by doing this amazing thing, by healing this man on the Sabbath. And I think it kind of tells us really that religious laws and religious things like that are, things that we do and how are there for us. They're not there to make religious laws should never be there to make life difficult, make things complicated and confusing, and make things exclusive and that sort of thing. Religious rules and things should be there to help us in and everything we do should point us to Jesus. So even things like often we go to church or things that we do in church, it should never be regulation for regulation's sake. It should always be there to help us in our walk with Jesus. And church administration, church regulation should always be there, and not to make life difficult, not to make life confusing or to make life exclusive. Certainly not. It should be there to point us to Jesus. And Jesus shows us that by showing that he is Lord of the Sabbath, even of the Sabbath. So he shows he's Lord of the Sabbath and proves it by healing this man. And there's a lesson for us, as I say, in making sure that things that we do in church should always be there to point us to Jesus. That's the first thing. The second thing is Jesus' selection of his disciples. And I think there are two things I want to say from this. Firstly, that it says that before he chose his disciples, he spent a whole night in prayer. I don't think I've ever spent a whole night in prayer. And Jesus clearly, wonderful example here. But I suppose it kind of tells us before we make important decisions in life, we should pray about it. We should pray. And Jesus, when he was picking his disciples, doing this very important thing, the 12 people who were going to follow him all the way, he spent the whole night with God. And there is a really important principle here, that whenever we make big decisions, we should pray about them. Not sure I'm good at spending all night in prayer. I wish I was better at that kind of thing. But I think there is a very important principle here, is that before we make big decisions in our lives, when we seek God's guidance in our lives, when we look where God is doing, whatever in our lives, we should pray. We should always pray about things first. And Jesus did. Before he selected his disciples, he prayed to God. And then there's the disciples themselves. And they always amuse me, really, because you kind of see pictures of disciples in stained glass windows looking sort of terribly holy and terribly Victorian and everything else. And looking very, as the butter wouldn't melt in their mouth. If you read through them, they're a right rum group of lads, really. Some of them were burly fishermen. Matthew was a tax collector, a sinner, a traitor, you might say. You got two of them, Simon the Zealot, and almost certainly Judas Iscariot, who were sort of on the terrorist on the other side of the story. It's a bit like trying to get people from complete opposite to what Jesus managed to do it. Two of them, James and John, were ambitious. They really were a right rum group of blokes, really. And it's amazing Jesus got them to work together, but he did, and that's who Jesus did. And of course, one of them even betrayed Jesus in the end. So they were a right rum group of blokes, you might say. But God and Jesus has an amazing way of turning people around. And he took these 12 blokes with all their weaknesses, and actually, doesn't it tell us that there's hope for the rest of us, isn't there? If Jesus can use those, then Jesus could use us. But the great thing about it, as I say, he took those blokes and he turned them around. And he turned them in the end from 12 or 11 frightened men whose doors were locked for fear of the Jews, and turned them into the 12 who set the world on fire, who told people about the gospel, and hence we have the gospel today. So Jesus had an amazing way of turning things round and turning, imperfect people like the disciples and making them into great men of God. So, my friends, two things. Firstly, the Sabbath. Jesus shows by his teaching and by healing the man with the withered hand that he is Lord of the Sabbath. And he tells us that rules in church and so on should always be there for our benefit. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That proves that. And the other thing is, before he picked his 12 disciples, he prayed about it, and so should we. And rejoice in the fact that he took these 12 ordinary blokes and turned them into extraordinary men of God. And Jesus did it then, and he does it now. And Jesus can take the weakness that we have and that we are and turn us round and make us into extraordinary people of God too.